Hello there, friends. Mandibil here. Taking the liberty to, smack my body on the sofa and take the next installment lying down rather than sitting. And I'm getting too old for this shit, as they say, right? No. The show must go on. And then I, I guess this is part five of my deconstruction. I should be able to get finished with lecture one, the illusionist option. Now we are getting into radical realism and something with the funny guy with the long rock star hair and a leather jacket is David Chalmers. So let's see what Mr. Frankish has to tell us.
Very broad groupings. I'll just say a few words. We could spend a whole course looking at either of these positions, but I'll just say a few words here to orient ourselves with regard to them. So, radical realism, the most common version of this is property dualism. This is the idea that phenomenal properties are non-physical properties. They're roughly then not among the properties studied by the physical sciences. So the sort of catalogue of properties that the physical sciences are developing, the physics and chemistry and biology and cognitive science and so on, don't include these properties. We're going to have to extend our science in radical ways in order to accommodate consciousness, according to this view. Now, this is property dualism, not substance dualism. The suggestion here isn't that we have immaterial souls distinct from our bodies. It's that our brains have dual properties. They have the physical properties studied by third-person science, and then they have these extra phenomenal properties. Now, the challenge for this view is really to explain how these phenomenal properties are related to physical ones, and in particular to explain.
I think what I'm having a little hard time understanding what he's actually trying to get at here. There are a lot of things, physical sciences, among the properties, non-physical phenomenal property dual. It's sort of technical jargon that is thrown at you as if you sort of understand it already, right? So, but and that can be a little annoying at times. Right? I don't find it necessary, to be this academic about it. Right? It should be easy to explain this. Most people, as I've said before, most people can get around in the everyday. And they can, drive a car, drive a bicycle, find food without killing themselves, and mostly not, treating other people like shit, right? Or whatever, how you want to put it. So mostly things work in the everyday without anybody having any understanding of property dualism or, phenomenal properties and non-physicalism and whatever, right? So why is it so difficult to explain these things for a philosopher? Well, the only answer I can see is that they want it to be difficult. They want to create some kind of artificial barrier between normal people and normal life and their ivory tower, right? So it's just annoying to me, right? But I'm used to it. But I remember that David Chalmers have claimed that one way to get around challenge of finally, one of the challenges of finally answering that elusive, hard problem of consciousness is to figure out some better kind of physics. But again, it's a problem of these philosophers. They haven't identified the paradox, as I've, pointed out earlier in this series and also in other series by Bernardo Kastrup and Stefan Molyneux and other stuff, that this paradox there is in their explanations of how they get to that foundation they used to get to these questions, right? So the question doesn't arrive from the outside, it arrives from the inside. But if you're on the inside of your experiences, your question doesn't deal with that outside. It doesn't have access to somehow. In one sense, you could say, right? So is this taking the territory out of the map, which is actually a good metaphor I like from Bernardo Castro, even though I disagree about a lot of things about what he's saying, some fundamental errors or leaps of faith, you could say, right, pun intended, that are completely unfounded, right? But there are certain things that he gets right. The basics of this paradox, he understands that there are things you can't say without making some kind of leap, and that leap, in my opinion, has to be based on axioms, right? You state that I'm making this, I'm deciding, I'm going with this, right? If somebody can point out you're not able to make this leap, or you don't want to participate in, having anything to do with me because I'm taking that leap in my philosophy, fine, that's up to you. I won't force you to use my axioms, right? And I think that's this is the approach that is the one that's going to make it functional between people, that they agree upon those axioms they use to get to those conclusions they are getting to in the end. If you don't agree with the axioms, well then, fine. Let's not encumber each other with each other's weird philosophy, right? Let's split apart then, right? But in this, there's this fetish in academic philosophy that there must be one answer, and I have to tell everybody this is how everybody should do it, right? No, there might be 10,000 different philosophies, and you stick to those people who have the same philosophy as you have. And if you don't have a philosophy, well, that's your problem, right? And if I have a philosophy about things and you say I don't understand what we're talking about in these axioms and whatever, then that person hasn't done the sufficient thinking in order to get around between other people, right? Then they have to find somewhere that they can stay with people who are like them, right? Or who want to approach life without doing philosophy. I'm not going to be encumbered by people who don't want to think for themselves, right? So I don't want other people to be encumbered by my philosophy if they think it doesn't work. I will never enforce anything on anybody else. But I would like to have as they would like to have possibly the possibility of saying no, thank you, to deal with my sort of axioms, right? Then I would like to have the same ability to say no, thank you, I don't want to deal with your axioms, right? So, but this became a long, off-road. But somehow David Chalmers thinks that it's because there's something wrong, or that one solution could be there's something wrong with it, or it's too limited, the physics as it's known now. But the physics is based on your experience, right? And how your experience behaves. So using that to explain how that experience arrived is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's incredible that these people can't see this, right? It is actually really, really incredible.
What sort of causal role they have. It seems plausible to think that, it seems obvious that pains and pleasures and tastes and so on have an effect on us, have an effect on our behavior. But if these properties are non-physical ones, then that becomes a problem, because it looks as if science is going to be able to give an explanation for all changes in the physical world in physical terms. So it's plausible to think that whatever happens in your brain will be explicable in terms of previous states of your brain and of your body and of the environment and the physical world generally. Neuroscientists don't find things happening in the brain with no with no physical cause, and similarly elsewhere in nature. It looks as if the physical world is closed under causation, that everything that happens has a sufficient physical explanation. And if so, how do these phenomenal properties get into the picture? Now, one option is to say, well, that they do somehow. They do have a causal influence, and this has got to be. We haven't yet discovered exactly where it is or how it happens. Maybe it happens at some quantum level, something like that. We don't know. Another option is to simply accept that they don't have a causal influence, that they're epiphenomenal, that they're a kind of side effect of all the information processing and so on the brain is doing, and that it's really all the physical processes in the brain that are causing the effects and the reactions, and that this inner world of mental qualities just sort of goes along for the ride. We think it's causing the events, our reactions, because it always occurs just before them. So the pain occurs just before we shout, "Ow!" But it wasn't actually the pain that made us shout out. A third option that's receiving quite a lot of attention at the moment is panpsychism. Here the idea is that really all of the physical world has a phenomenal aspect to it. Its phenomenal properties are not just restricted to our brains, that elementary particles have a little bit of consciousness, a little sort of micro-consciousness, and that our human consciousness is a combination of the...
I have a clear distinction that Keith Frankish wants this philosophy to be sort of halfway scientific, right? As far as he can get, some kind of physics or something that can be measured, whatever, right? As far as he can get to that, he wants to use that to explain stuff, right? And that's why this hard problem of consciousness is going to bite him in the ass until he figures out by some accord that there's a paradox built into this kind of thinking. No matter how much you change your physics, you're never going to get to it, because you're using that. You're basically sort of standing in the bucket trying to lift yourself up, right? It will never work. It will never work. You can throw as many words as you want at this problem. It's unsolvable, because you cannot get to that. You can't get to that which you need to get to in order to answer the question. And also, who gives a fuck, right? I have my qualia, and my mind tends to objectify specific aspects of that qualia as elephants and tigers and cucumbers and bicycles and so on, right? And that's what I need to objectify. I don't care how the qualia appeared, right? Because first of all, I can't get to that explanation. And secondly, it doesn't matter, because I'm going to have the experiences anyhow, right? Right? So, and I can't change them. I'm getting those experiences I'm going to get, no matter if I want them or not, right? So it's like, it's futile. It's sort of make work. It's sort of academic, self-flagellation of some kind in order to make some money or keep working in this ivory tower. That's all I can see in it, right? It makes no sense that there are people spending a lot of money trying to solve this problem that is unsolvable. It's ridiculous. Stop doing it. Stop funding these people. They're wasting everybody's time, and they're actually camouflaging because they don't identify this paradox that's built into their thinking. They're sort of looking in the wrong place constantly. They think the Holy Grail is answering this question, and they never get to it, right? They'll never get to it this way, right? It can't be answered. So it's a complete waste of time.
The micro-consciousnesses of all the particles that compose our brains or our bodies. And this view kind of ties in the phenomenal to the material, to the physical, much more tightly. And its proponents think that it can account for our intuitions about consciousness having a causal role. The difficulty, of course, is that it does involve supposing that consciousness is much more widespread in the physical world than we have reason to think. Here's a picture of David Chalmers, whose 1996 book, The Conscious Mind, really stimulated a lot of these radical realist research programs. Okay, the other main option is conservative realism, or we might call it physicalist realism. The idea here is that these phenomenal properties are really just physical properties, maybe just patterns of neuron firing in the brain, perhaps. They don't seem like it, but that's what they are. Okay, so all of these intuitions about their being non-physical and are hard to explain and so on, they're misleading. But they're still real. The phenomenal properties are still quite real. There really is this inner world of mental feels, what it is, likenesses, but they are just ordinary physical properties of the sort that a neuroscientist could, in principle, detect and observe. And so the task for conservative realists is to explain away our intuitions about the non-physicality of phenomenal properties. The major strategy here is what's called the phenomenal concept strategy. The idea is that we have special ways of thinking about our own experiences that we apply introspectively and that are very different from the ways we have of thinking about the things in the external world, physical things in the external world. And because of this difference of ways of thinking, we get misled into believing that there's a difference in the things we're thinking about. Okay, so we think about our experience in a very different way from the way we think about, say, apples and tables and chairs and things, and that misleads us into thinking that our experiences are something very different, belong to a very different kind of world, a non-physical world. Now, the major challenge for this view, I think, is to justify its realism. Conservative realists want to agree with the radical realists that these qualia, what it is, likenesses, phenomenal properties, that they're real. They really are. They're real.
What does it mean that it's real? You're talking about these qualia and so on, fine. But it's as if you think that there's some other realm that is sort of given. You don't even have to discuss it or explain it, or maybe not explain, but settle this is how I get to this, and this is how I understand this. It's just like, is it real or not? Well, what do you mean by real, right? It's weird. It's like philosophy that takes anything as given is shitty philosophy. You have to start from the ground and work through everything, right? And leaving nothing out or taking nothing for granted. You can't just say, is it real? Right? What do you mean by real, right? So there's these aspects I'm pointing to and sort of criticizing the way he uses words or terms and don't explain them or define. It's an indirect pointer that he's a bad philosopher. He's not a good philosopher. He doesn't understand how he needs to approach this. He has this pet subject about these qualia, right? And that they are an illusion. Okay, argue for it, fine. But it's as if everything else is given. That's not how philosophy is supposed to be done, right? I'm not going to accept that as good philosophy, that's for sure, right? And I will encourage you to think along the same line, right? Or at least make some good decision about how to trust what people say. No, nothing is given, right? Nothing is given. That's the whole foundation for how to do philosophy. Be skeptical, be doubtful, right? Descartes, doubt. I think therefore I am. Okay, that's where we start then, right? If you can't get deeper than that, okay, that's where we start. You can't just take things for granted. He should understand that, and it is incredible that he sort of attempts to, in the sort of snake oil salesman, just look at this little area over here that's interesting, and qualia, but the rest is just given to us, right? Bullshit.
And so they still have to address the hard problem and explain how the brain produces them. Whereas it seems that...
Why, I might ask? Why do I need to explain, or why do anybody need to explain how colors and tastes and sounds and so on appears? Why do I need to explain that? There are a lot of millions of people in the world who go about there every day without explaining anything, or even thinking that they might have to explain this. They don't need us to explain anything. So why do you think it needs to be explained, right? Otherwise you might not make a living, or what?
Most of what they have to say is about explaining away our intuitions. It's about explaining our intuitions about them, why we think they're non-physical, why we think they're ineffable, why we think they can't be explained in physical terms, and so on. Now, that's all very well, but there's a danger that it's going to slide into the view that phenomenal properties don't really exist, that our intuition that they exist is also misleading, which will be to slide into illusionism. If they're to resist this slide...
Well, you have slided into an understanding that you don't need to explain what it means to exist. Traditionally, that is, the idea of ontology in metaphysics. You don't need to explain that, apparently, right? There are possibly some philosophers who spend all their day for 30 years trying to get to an understanding what it means to exist. But you're just, I'm just saying exist, and that, that's it. Done.
Then conservative realists must say that phenomenal properties are real in some meaty and substantial sense, a sense that is essentially the same as the sense in which radical realists claim they exist. And I think the challenge for conservative realists is to do that. One option for the conservative realist here is to say that really they can't explain how these properties arise. They could say they are just physical properties. They're not something over and above the physical properties of the brain, but we can't really explain their existence. We can't show in the way that we could show with the television set how the properties of the brain amount to phenomenal properties. We can't give that kind of reductive explanation. We can't show how what's happening in the brain is sufficient for these properties to exist. But still they do exist, and they are just physical. Now, maybe that's a possible position, but I think it's a defeatist position in that it's giving up on the project of trying to explain consciousness. If you think that these properties are essential to consciousness and you think they can't be explained, then you can't explain consciousness. Okay. So this brings us finally to illusionism. As I said, I'm just going to sketch what the position is here. I'm not going to argue for it. I'm not going to try to make it sound particularly plausible. I'm just going to tell you what it is in outline. Again, like the other programs, it's a very broad, like the other positions, it's a very broad grouping, and many different forms of illusionist theory could be developed. But here's the outline. Okay, so illusionism...
There are two apples, right? He's apparently experiencing two apples, right? But if he can't experience two apples, right, if he says there are two apples, then the one in the brain is not the one outside, right? But they have to be the same if he says, I know what's outside. So there's an apple both in your mind and the same kind of apple outside, but if it's not the same kind, the one in the mind is different from the one outside, right? So what you have access to is the one inside. And if you're saying there's an apple outside, it must be different. But if it's different, it's not the same as the experience. That means you can only have the experience. So if you're saying there's an apple outside, well, how do you get to that? Right? But you can say, okay, I have an experience, and axiomatically I'm going to decide to treat it as if it's outside my mind, or what you have to accept being a representation of that which is outside. Right? But then all you have are experiences inside your mind. And then poof, away goes the hard problem of consciousness, right? Because you can't get to it anyway, right? You can't get to it. I mean, the problem doesn't go away, but you have to accept, or you have to realize that you can't get to the answer. So it doesn't matter. It's futile, it's ridiculous. Don't waste your time. Spend your time on trying to solve this stupid problem. So,
involves two basic claims. The first claim is that phenomenal properties do not exist. All this talk about phenomenality, about what it is likeness, about qualia, about subjective feels, this isn't picking out anything real. It might be confusedly picking out something else that is real, but it's not picking out anything like what it's supposed to be picking out. Those things, this inner world of qualia, doesn't exist. That's the first claim. I'll come to the second claim in a moment.
Bad philosophy, right? Don't start with the claims, okay, I'm claiming this just out of the blue, right? I'm claiming this, and then I'll explain it afterwards. That's how they always do it, right? Because they're not good at presenting philosophy, right? They start with conclusion and then try to convince you of how they get to the conclusion. The way to really do it is to start from what I would call the reduction base or the ground floor, and then argue your way through and say, okay, now would you agree with me that we are arriving at this conclusion, right? That's the way you do it. You don't give the conclusion and then sort of you're impregnating your listener with the conclusion, so they sort of already have sort of halfway accepted it to some degree, or at least have to, conceptualize it in their mind. And that's sort of, you can't say to people you shouldn't think of a polar bear, and then they think about that which they shouldn't think about, right? So it's like you're impregnated by using the certain terms and words and so on, arguments. You're impregnating people you're grooming them to have an easier, but this should actually be a pointer that you should really be careful. When people start with a conclusion and then try to argue for it afterwards, it's because that probably isn't that good an argument. They can't follow rigidly from one step to the other, and which show that it must lead to this or that conclusion. They're just throwing the conclusion at you and then hope you are going to accept whatever, explanation that come up with afterwards.
So illusionists will say that consciousness is a functional process, a wholly functional process. And that sensory information is conscious when illusionists might do.
The sensory info is conscious. What is that? What is the sensory? How do you get to it? What is the sensory information? Isn't it colors, sounds, and there is nothing else. All else you could possibly refer to are abstractions or cognitions or, laws or whatever, use the scientific method to create some kind of law or how these things seems to be moving around. But that's something that happened after you have experienced it, right? So how do you experience this information, this sensory information? There is no sensory information that is handed to you. You have your qualia, and how you interpret those qualia is the only thing that you possibly can call some kind of information. But what does it make? What is it that makes it information? If you experience elephant, and you say, okay, that's information. So what are you adding to the fray, right? But what are you adding to it? You're just deciding to call it information as if you're sort of inherently upgrading it to some better standard or higher standard or whatever, right? But you're not adding anything. You're not explaining anything. You're not even making an axiom or definition or anything like that. So it's like there's all this thing going on around these qualia that you think are sort of given. And everybody must understand this. And then these qualia, well, we just need to drop these qualia and then, whatever, right? But how do you get to all that other stuff you're referring to, right? Without the qualia? That's ridiculous, man, right?
Develop different accounts of the functions involved, but this is the default one that I'll assume for the sake of this of these lectures. We'll get into some more details here in lecture 5. So the basic default position I'm going to assume is that sensory information is conscious when it is available to a wide range of control systems and generates a wide range of reactions, small and large, as we talked about earlier. That sort of global broadcast of information, that is what consciousness is. Daniel Dennett has spoken of this as informational influence or fame in the brain. Here's a quotation from him. Consciousness is cerebral celebrity. Nothing more and nothing less. Nothing more. Note. Those contents are conscious that persevere, that monopolize resources long enough to achieve certain typical and symptomatic effects. Effects on memory, on the control of behavior, and so forth.
What the hell is that? Consciousness is cerebral celebrity? It may be taken slightly out of context, but okay, that's not my fault. Nothing more and nothing less. Consciousness is cerebral celebrity. Those contents are conscious that persevere, that monopolize resources long enough to achieve certain typical and symptomatic effects on memory, on the control of behavior, and so forth. What the hell are these guys talking about, man, right? I mean, it's like, they're doing everything they can to sound like they're very knowledgeable and have, fancy words and so on, right? Almost like the sort of a pros. They're trying to avoid making sure that as many people can understand it as possible. They want to sound smart, right? So I basically have no respect for that.
Information becomes conscious in virtue of its effects. That's the difference between subliminal perception and attentive perception, conscious experience. In conscious experience, the information is having a much, much richer set of effects. Now the second claim. Phenomenal properties seem to exist, in some sense of seem. Now you might immediately think, oh, but if they seem to exist, then they do exist because they're just seemings. If it seems that
I can't see when I paused the video, I can't see the text very clearly, but phenomenal properties seem to exist in some sense of seem. Using the term sense here is not particularly smart, but in some sense of seem. Phenomenal properties, are those the qualia, or I'm confused, right? Seem to exist. What does it mean that they seem to exist? And what does it mean to exist? He hasn't explained what it means to exist. In some sense of seem. Oh man, can it get more fluffy than this? Oh. So, man.
that I'm in pain, then I am in pain. It's a very common objection to illusionism, and it's one we're going to talk a lot about. Here I'm just going to state this. Phenomenal properties in some sense seem to exist. In some sense of seem. I'll come back to all this later.
Okay, so I'll come back to it later. Yeah. It's like it has this air of, I can just throw the conclusion in your face because you're going to accept whatever explanation I'm going to give you later. We'll get back to that. Yes, I'll give you half of the explanation, but we'll get back to the explanation. Oh man, right? Walk people through your thinking. Don't throw the conclusion in their face and then give some half-ass explanation later. Because that's what it's going to be, in my opinion. I'm hazarding a guess here, right? But I hate this kind of philosophy, and this is always how it's done. People don't walk you through the real life or the what's it called, real-time philosophy. They step ahead and say, this is the conclusion I arrived, and then they step back and say, okay, I'm going to, explain. See, I arrived at that conclusion, right? So it's quite manipulative, I would say.
Here's a quick sketch of why they seem to exist. As I said earlier, right at the beginning, we can introspect. We're aware of our own experiences. We can describe them. We can recognize them, describe them, react to them. We can.
What does he mean by recognize experiences? Now he calls it experiences. He used another word before, and before that he used yet another word, qualia, and what was the last one? I forget. And now it's experiences. It's also a bad sign when they use potentially different words for the same, is he confusing you by using different terms, or maybe just doesn't care that he's using the different term for the same thing, right? And if he's talking about different things, why is he talking about some different thing all of a sudden without pointing out, now I'm talking about something different, right? And why it's different, and why I need to talk about this now, is sort of all over the place, right? It's just a piece of crap, this, right?
Introspect our experiences and acquire information about them. And this depends on mechanisms of introspection, just like our awareness of the world depends on mechanisms of perception. We know about the apple because we have mechanisms of perception. We know about our experience of the apple because we have mechanisms of introspection. And these mechanisms monitor our experiences in the sense of the informational and reactive processes that I talked about. Introspection monitors those processes and supplies information about them to higher level control systems, such as language, so that we can report our experiences.
Why do I need to report an experience? Should I call you up and say, now I feel like going to the toilet, right? Or, my pizza is red and yellow, right? Do I need to report it to you or what, right? No, I don't. I don't need to report anything. What about mute people, right? You could say they have sign language or whatever, but you don't need to say anything or do anything or report anything, right? And reporting us sort of a particular way of doing so, making certain sounds or making certain movements or creating certain signs or whatever, that is accepted, or accepted may be a little fluffy term to use, but tends to be accepted, right, within a certain group of people. Why do we need to report? You don't need to report anything, right? And monitoring our experiences, well, what experience exactly are you talking about? The information or reactive processes. But as I said, there is no information arriving, right? There might be something arriving, but you can't just call it information, because information is some kind of interpretation of what is going on that is somehow important in a way, right? Otherwise, why categorize it, right? But what makes you able to say that the information arrives? What's the kind of sense? You don't have an information sense, a sixth sense, where information arrives and say, aha, you're supposed to understand this as this, and you're supposed to, that's important and this is important. If there's anything that points to some importance in your experience, that comes from the inside the mind alone, right? You objectify things like elephant and so on, and then because you objectify it, your mind has already connected certain emotions and desires or reactions to those particular qualia. You can also develop them, but when you see a particular kind of, breakfast cereal, well, then you get the urge to eat it or not eat it, depending on your experience. Of it tastes bad, well, then you develop sort of a not wanting to eat based on that object, whatever, right? It sort of develops. When I see a tiger, I tend to, want to run away, right? But that doesn't arrive from the outside. Tiger comes from the inside. That's me identifying tiger in my qualia using my cognitive abilities. It's the cognitive abilities that says tiger in the experience, right? The tiger doesn't arrive from the outside, right? How could it possibly, right?
And these higher level control systems then generate further reactions. So there's a dual cyclical process here. There's the first process of perception, of information and reaction, which constitutes perception. And then there's a second cycle of information and reaction that constitutes introspection.
So when he says introspection, is that when I say I'm aware of my experiences, I'm aware that colors and sound and so on, and you could say I'm aware of the cognitions, but there's sort of, it depends on how you want to classify or specify these things, right? That there's an awareness or there's a consciousness or meta-consciousness, even if you want to go that high, right? About whatever it is you're conscious about, to stay in his terminology, right? So his meta-conscious is conscious of his own consciousness, right? Is that what you call introspection? I'm just sort of, I suppose that's what he means. So, yeah.
So because of introspection, we don't just notice things in the world and react to things in the world. We notice our noticing.
Again, in the world. Where is that world? Is it in your mind? So you have some qualia over here, but don't look at those. No. I have the world here also in my mind. Well, it must be. Otherwise, you couldn't freaking experience it or report about it, right? If it was outside you, how the hell would you have access to it, right? How does that world get to you? Think, goddammit, right?
It is that we're noticing things and we react to our reacting. And it's this that creates the illusion of a private inner world populated with mental qualities, with qualia. The idea here...
What? What is it? Is it the introspection that creates? I mean, but the apple is out there now. Right now, there's no other apple. There's sort of a gray apple that has lost its colors. Only the gray are left. So, but what is if the apple is out there, right? What is that information? What is that? Is that a little package, a little manual that somehow the apple has sent to your mind or whatever? Because photons are not apples, right? Otherwise, you're saying an apple is decomposed into photons and traveling through your, arriving in your mind. But then the apple is no longer out there if it has to travel through your eyes and into your mind and whatever, right? How the hell does this work? Oh my God. Ah.
There is that introspection is misleading. The information it provides is schematic and impressionistic. It delivers a partial and distorted view of the processes it's tracking, which are, of course...
Okay, so you, by mental masturbation, is able to justify whether or not something is distorted or is correct, or how the hell do you get to do that? Right? Is there some part of your mind that has the solution? And then there's these qualia that's out to get you and out to confuse you, and there's distorted view of your experiences. Don't trust it. They're there to, fool you. No. There's another part of my mind where I have the solution. There's all the information. Don't trust the other thing. Oh.
Of course, highly complex processes. This isn't a fault in introspection. We don't need to know all the gory detail of what our brains are doing. We just need a kind of outline, a sketch, enough to enable us to recognize experiences, compare them, recall them, report them to other people, and so on. We don't, a sketch, a caricature, that's all we need. But it has a side effect. It creates a false impression about what it is that we're aware of. It creates the impression that our experiences have phenomenal properties, that there is this inner world of qualia, of subject.
Inner world? What is that compared to what? An outer world? So it's sort of this dualism I'm having a hard time with, right? So there's now this apple popped up again, the second apple. So the first apple is still out there, and then that it's out there. But then mind, if the mind already knows there's an apple out there, why does it need to have an experience of it, right? That seems ridiculous. If the mind knows there's an apple and that's what you want, apparently, then what is the mind doing with this experience bullshit, right? And if you're able to use that same mind to figure out, then this qualia is not important. I mean, there's something that just doesn't fit together, right? You should be able to sense there's something wrong in your thinking here. And the word sense is not maybe the best word to use in this context. But it's the notion that this is getting more and more complicated rather than simpler and simpler and explanatory is my beef, right? One of my beefs. When you have there's an apple out there and there's an apple in there and there are all sorts of the experiences and external, internal impressions and phenomenal properties, and it's just Piling words and another arrow and another arrow and the brain and the two apples and it's too complicated, right? This can never work. It's probably full of bullshit, right? You're not solving anything. You're just making it more complicated, right? So I'm not buying this. I mean, it has all the flags that says, "Don't look at this," right?
It feels that there is something going on over and above all the information processing and the reactions that it's generating. But this is an illusion. The phenomenal properties are merely intentional objects. Intentional object is something that exists only as the object of a belief or representation. For example, Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes exists only in our thoughts. Or unicorns, or Father Christmas. We can talk about these things. They can play a useful role, perhaps. It's very interesting to read about Sherlock Holmes. Very entertaining. But he doesn't really exist. He exists only as an object of our thoughts. And so, the phenomenal properties. That's the illusion in illusionism. Let's return.
It's very, very, very unclear to me what he's talking about. Right? Even if I don't agree with him, I should be able to understand what he's sort of talking about, right? But and I'm not even sure what way he wants to go with this. Is he just out to say, okay, these colors and sounds and so on, they're not really there? They're not real and not existing or whatever, right? Because this fucking heart problem, I want to get rid of it, right? I hate it. We need to be able to explain everything. Is that the whole? It's futile, useless philosophy, right? And also sort of there's this sort of goofy with this woman with this box and so on. It rubs me all the wrong ways, like he's trying to manipulate me, right? And okay, maybe the little people, they need a little story, a little adventure, something that's that appeals to the sort of mainstream or something. Just give me the freaking philosophy straight up, right? No bullshit, right? Just do it strictly, do it simply, use some strict and simple definition I can follow, right? And get to the fucking point, man, right?
And to our story. Next day, you're in the market again, and you see the old woman. And you really want to know how she made the beetle appear in the box. So you approach her and you offer her a large reward for telling you the secret. How did she do it? And she says, well, it's quite simple, really. There was never a beetle in the box. You see, I'm a hypnotist. And what I did was to hypnotize you into believing that you'd seen a beetle in the box.
Man. What is this?
Is that right? Could she really have done that? What really happened when you looked through the peephole? Did you see?
Maybe she's lying. Maybe she's just telling you something.
Can a person really hypnotize?
Maybe it's all a dream. And my, get it away from me, man.
Is you into believing you've seen something you haven't? Well, you're going to have to think about this. Okay. So next time we will start to build the case for illusionism by looking at the case against phenomenal realism, against the view that qualia exist. And we'll be looking at some arguments from Dan Dennett in particular. Here's a photograph of Dan again from the Greenland cruise in 2014.
Oh, how nice, huh? The philosophers can get on a cruise to Greenland and discuss the qualia, right? Why do you need to go to some, fancy place, right? Are you using your eyes and your ears to experience, nice weather and icebergs and so on? All these, rich qualia, right? Why just not the Zoom meeting, right? Something like that. Maybe there wasn't Zoom back then, but whatever, right? No. They want better qualia, right? And if they can get, the university to pay for their, little cruise, well, fine, right? Who wouldn't want to go to Greenland, right?
So, that's the end of this lecture, and I'll see you again soon.
Okay, so this was the end of lecture 1, and then I don't even remember the name of lecture 2. It's called The Case Against Qualia. And, well, there you have it. That was my deconstruction of lecture 1 in 5 parts. Let's see how long I can hold this. He's very slow and very boring to listen to. And he's confusing, and it's not presenting any definitions or anything that is approaching definitions, just throwing words left and right, to a large extent at least, right? Yeah, think about this, right? This guy has been sitting in Crete philosophizing for 20 years, whatever, right? And this is what he's come up with? Is this the fruit of his endeavors, right? Get the bleep out of my face, man, right? Oh, okay. See you in the next one.